All right, today on Meet the Neighborhood, I'm really excited about our guest because he has got a crazy good story to tell about growing up in really difficult circumstances to riding his bike all the way across Canada, giving back to his community and growing do I say business empire? Because you're growing it.
Yeah, we're growing.
Empire might be a strong word, but I'll talk to you in 5 years and then we can use that word. And he's also written an amazing book called Butterflies in the Trenches, which we'll get to in a few minutes too. It's a story of resiliency, inspiration, entrepreneurship, hustle, connection, networking, all the above. And he is building a little cottage industry around the connections and the good that he wants to do back in his community. Curtis Carmichael is with us today. Curtis, how are you, man?
Good. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Was that an accurate description?
Yeah, it was good. You don't want to give him too much.
Listen, let's start back with, because I first found out about your story through mutual friends of ours, the Marlings. I had a chance to read your book and hear more about your story because I remember when you did the ride across Canada, but let's kind of go back to growing up in inner city Scarborough back in the day and what that was like day to day for you. And I want to talk a little bit about how that sort of shaped who you are today. So give people kind of an idea of what that would look like. Because for folks that grew up in my neighborhood, it sounds like you grew up in the movies that we used to watch.
Yeah. So I can give you a quick snippet. So just backtrack a quick note. My parents are from Guyana in South America. So it's the northern tip of South America. And we moved to Regent Park first in Toronto. And for those who don't know what Regent Park is the oldest government housing community in North America, but also Toronto Community Housing, which is the umbrella for all public housing projects in Toronto, is actually the largest public housing project in Canada. So it's massive. So we landed in Regent Park, and then soon after we moved to Scarborough, where I spent most of my formative years. I was in Regent Park until 6, and then I was in Scarborough pretty much until I was 27. And in that community, typical public housing community, but the difference is Scarborough is the most culturally and ethnically diverse place in North America. So the cultures in our community, we have people who are South Asian, East Asian, all across the continent of Africa, all across Europe, all across South America, the Caribbean. We had African Americans from the U.S. We had Black Nova Scotians. There's just so much culture in our community. So we didn't have to go venture off to restaurants. Our whole neighborhood was a restaurant tour, right? So that was a community, very vibrant, lots of community love, lots of talent, lots of cookouts, barbecues, sports tournaments, anything that was entrepreneurial was happening. You had people selling DVDs and CDs out their trunk, vinyl records, hair salons on porches, hair salons in backyards, restaurants out of people's backyards. We had people doing anything like illegal activity too, like drugs, flipping bikes for cash, playing dice games, gambling in the neighborhood. Just a wide range of entrepreneurial activity. And there's people who have clothing lines too. So there's a wide range of stuff that was happening in our community. We had IT people too in our neighborhood at the time, fixing computers, early 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. So that's like the culture of the community. But despite that reality, that culture is usually missed because it's usually highlighted by the violence that we mostly know. So the violence could be, always say it's the byproduct of what happens when you systemically deny funding to a community over history.
Right.
So underfunded schools, underfunded community programs, and people are left outside to survive by any means. So if you can't get a job, the streets will employ you. So the streets employed a lot of people in illegal activity, and that's what people ended up having to do to provide for, pay for the light bill, buy baby formula, different things like that. It ended up being a short-term solution, but ended up being a long-term thing because once you get in, it's hard to get out.
Right.
So that's kind of the culture. But when you're growing up as a kid, you don't understand. You just know that, hey, how come that community center keeps closing every 2 to 3 years? And then we go 2 to 3 years without programs.
Yeah.
You don't really understand. But then when you look at history, as I outline in my book, the data shows this is systemic. This has been across all major institutions. So it's not by chance that our communities and our schools and the unemployment rate's really high. That's not by chance. It's based on how they fund the city, and they tend to neglect our community. So
Well,
that's kind of the scope.
well, it's funny you bring that up because in the book you actually draw like a direct straight line between defunding schools and education and community programs and increased police funding. Like there's a direct correlation there. And then you sort of explain about the detrimental impact that had on the ground in the community. And I don't think a lot of people understand the scope of that and the impact it has on a young person's psyche and growing up in that environment. What impact does that have on you? And I say your psyche and your You know, because obviously you're a much different guy as a grown up, but like what was that doing to your psyche as a kid when you're looking around going like, it feels like everything's weighted against you?
Yeah, so I think it messes with your psyche because you end up being in a position where there's a quote that I follow. It's like, "We're not the cause, but we're the effect." When there's so many things happening around you that you cannot control, and there's very little things that you can control, it kind of makes you live a life on edge.
Right.
It's like your mindset is, we're either in the middle of some stuff going south, we just left something that went south, or we're preparing for something to go south. So you're in a constant position of like, just stay ready.
They
That's
talk
not,
they talk about that with soldiers.
yeah. So that's the thing. I'll often compare it like, one year in the book you see, I lost about 11 people in 1 year when I was 11 years old. Half of them to gun violence, a couple to death by suicide, and then also others by natural causes. So the mentality for a young kid is that when you see all this stuff happening, in addition to drive-by shootings, in addition to the racism we're constantly facing in schools and communities, at workplaces, all of that gets you into a position where all of that is trauma on your body. So for a lot of people who are very well versed in mental health, they understand that what kids see, families see in communities like this, we're not prepared or trained or have the supports in place to help us cope. But for comparable things like the military, as you mentioned, when people go off to war, they're trained to face what they're facing, but they still come back sick. So the reality is that we can normalize mental health issues, mental health concerns, mental illnesses for people who go to war. But I always say you need to look at it twofold. If young kids are seeing bodies laid out on the concrete, people falling from like the 12th floor of the building, you see the whole situation. These kinds of things, you don't have areas to get supports. We don't have access to those. So in a community, you tend to bottle everything in and you don't process it until your adulthood. Like it took me till I was 27 to get therapy. I have a therapist. I do group counseling. I do a lot of other stuff. But really what it does, it gives you tools and strategies to manage with all that stuff that has happened in your life. Because otherwise, it's kind of like hurt people. But then before
Yep.
hurt others, hurt people hurt themselves. So that's when you have this mentality of self-escape. I call it serial escapism. So we choose some type of a vehicle to escape what we're facing so we don't have to deal with it. So for me, I chose like sports. All I did was sports. I never had a time to sit alone. Some people choose drugs. Some people choose excessive cleaning, excessive volunteering, excessive working. Everyone has like some people are bookworms in my community. We do everything to keep our mind occupied so we don't have to sit with ourselves and
Yeah.
our own thoughts and what has happened. So that's kind of the scope of what it does to the psyche of a young person who lives in poverty locally or globally.
Well, and I think and obviously it shapes your worldview growing up. And I think as you sort of build that worldview growing up, a lot of that can be shaped by our role models too. And I know uh, growing up in some of that chaos, because obviously there's a lot of beauty there too, but then the chaos sort of gets highlighted as you mentioned. But you had some really unique role models come out of that neighborhood that taught you some really interesting different skill sets. And I know you mentioned earlier about people that were making bikes
Yeah.
and what that looked like, and how one of your friends was able to create an entrepreneurial type venture, building bikes for groceries, because that was another thing we didn't understand, or I didn't understand before I read your book, was food deserts. And so tell me a little bit about the role models that you had growing up in the neighborhood and what you learned from them.
Yeah, definitely. I think the cool part of my story and the unique part of my story, usually you hear, oh, the camp counselor or the teacher helped them. And really, my story is everyone who's usually outcasted by society are my role models. So the dealers taught me about everything in business, supply chain management, marketing,
Right.
sales. They taught me about like how to flip things for cash and reinvest in your business, how to manage your staff, like different things like that. So I
Yeah,
learned a lot of
it's
transferable.
true.
But then in my community, there's also another kid who sparked my interest because it wasn't about only drugs happening in the community. A lot of people are doing other stuff like clothing lines, restaurants, hair salons. But he also made bikes for cash. So the story about Dr. Alex, we call him in the neighborhood, we always say he's a doctor because he has a PhD in the streets. He doesn't
Yeah.
have a PhD in academia. So Dr. Alice was a 12-year-old kid, 90s baby, and he comes from a Jamaican background as well. And in our community, his solution for the food deserts was to figure out how we can get to the grocery store faster. It took about 60 minutes to get to the grocery store if you walk, but then sometimes, depending on the way the transit works, sometimes it can take 40 minutes one way, all the way up to an hour and a half, because Toronto Transit typically only works well in affluent and a very high income status communities. Communities like Scarborough, the Rexdales, the Jane and Finch community, horrible transit and it's strategic. And that's also another act of underfunding certain parts of the city that tend to have people who come from BIPOC and low income communities. And BIPOC is just a term for Black, Indigenous people of color. But Alex was like, you know what? Instead of paying for transit, which adds up, wasting all this time, let me just build a faster bike. So we ended up building a motorcycle, we called it, and it was out of a lawnmower and a bicycle. So we broke a lawnmower engine, repurposed it on a bicycle, used stuff from like toasters and microwaves, and just made a whole contraption to make it sustainable. So it was a gas-powered bike. We just called it a motorcycle because we couldn't afford a motorcycle. But the idea about this is early 2000s. This is well before things like this were normal. And doing that at 12 years old, his older brother obviously worked with him as a mentor as well. And he ended up flipping it for cash. So he upgraded other people's bike. Limited time, it's kind of limited, but there's only so much lawnmowers you can have. But he did upgrade a lot of bikes in the community. So that kind of inspired us to see that there's raw talent here. And it's that quote I follow, which is talent is universal, but opportunity is not. So if you flip that on the head, the positive approach, though opportunity is not universal, talent is. And when I saw that, I'm like, yo, he's a genius in this community, but in school, they outcasted us. They didn't treat us as geniuses. They didn't really see us as kids who could learn and grow. They saw us as like empty vessels to be filled. So Alex was successful in our community, but he was not successful in school for a lot of different reasons where they put us in courses below our ability. But that's one of my main inspirations, which caused me to start my own bike shop 2 years later. I ended up getting my bike stolen. And my decision was, you know what, let me actually build a bike business. So what I did was I went around the city of Scarborough. I borrowed some bikes, but also got some bikes from the garbage can.
Sourced some bikes.
Sourced. Got to be, my lawyer got to keep me straight. I sourced stuff. And the mentality was, how about I just flip bikes for cash, but I renovate bikes that are actually broken, worn down, and we flip them for an affordable price for kids in the neighborhood and older people. So we started that, and I ended up having it was about 10 people on the operation, me and my boy Imi. We ran the head, so we're like the CEO and COO, and then we had kind of our mechanics who are grade school mechanics, so kids who are like grade 1 to 3 and the grade 4 to 6 handle like our sales and marketing. We got to get the word out there. We didn't have social media. So a lot of those natural skills I was learning goes back to the term called design thinking. So design thinking is a concept where you design a solution for a problem that's based on the actual needs of the people. So by you spending time with the population that you're designing for, you're able to tailor make a solution that they'll actually use and they'll actually change their life. So that's a lot of the stuff in our community actually use design thinking, but design thinking is also used in any industry. When it came to developing the smartphone, before the smartphone, when it came to develop the iPod, before the iPod, when it became to developing BlackBerry phone, or when it comes to developing ergonomic chairs, headsets that fit, accessibility for people with disabilities, all that stuff actually at the core is design thinking. And design thinking is innate to everyone who lives in poverty. So that's kind of the mindset of my role models. Drug dealers, inmates, and kids who are just being entrepreneurial in the neighborhood were all my role models.
Well, and one of your role models is a guy, and by the way, you sent me this book and I'm partway through it now. It's brilliant. It's a book about Nipsey Hussle. And for people that aren't familiar with Nipsey's story, Nipsey is a guy that grew up in a very difficult neighborhood in Los Angeles, worked his way through success, and then was putting resources back into the community to rebuild that community. He didn't want to get out per se, get big and get out. He came back and he built businesses, he built community programs, he built mentorship programs, he employed people that couldn't get employed elsewhere because of criminal background. He was giving back to his community. And that story has a big impact with what you're doing, because you're doing the same thing with your community now. And I think a big chunk of this sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, started from the bike ride across Canada when you one day decided with a couple of buddies to raise some money to give back to your community, and you did it by riding your bike across Canada. Like, and it was self-planned, self-funded, self-organized. Like, this was not like a big corporate event. You guys did this grassroots from the seeds up, and turned up having a great impact on your community again. Tell us a little bit about the ride.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Nipsey's kind of the guiding light, the North Star, you know. I think my mindset was I was about to go pro, so I got an academic athletic ride to Queen's University. I played football. I was like all Canadian and stuff, and won a lot of national awards for the university. But my mindset was I wanted to play professional football, and at the time, I joined the CFL draft, signed with an agent. I was top 5 in my position for all my tests in front of CFL coaches. Was in talks with Hamilton and the Red Blacks, and my mindset was to go pro. That was it. But then at the time of the draft, I was back in my neighborhood after not living in my neighborhood for 5 years. I was in Kingston, training all over the summer. So when I was there, I'm like, this neighborhood looks exactly the same. Nothing has changed. It's getting worse. And part of me was trying to understand what was happening. So that's when I looked up all that data you see in my book. I knew all the data. I knew for the last several decades, they're strategically underfunding the community and then get confused when they see stuff happen. So that's when I was just like, you know what? I'm more passionate about my community. I'm just good at football. And that's when I made the decision to hang up my cleats, because my mindset was I want to have a long life with a big impact rather than a short life and be well known. Because I had a lot of concussions. So I had to make a call on my longevity, thinking of one day I want to have kids. I want to have a foundation for the community. So that's when I made the decision to come back. So when you do that, you're not a nobody, but you're no longer that person anymore, from being on like 50-foot posters on your university, getting interviewed by all the news outlets about your combine and CFL dreams. And now I'm just a guy on the block back in the hood. And that's difficult because I was back on a couch. Because at that point, my mom didn't think I was coming back, and they downsized their house to an apartment. So I hopped back. I'm back on the couch. So from that couch, the neighborhood community center hit me up. They said, "Hey, we lost 100K funding. Can you help us raise 100K?" I'm like, "All right, I'm gonna run across Canada." I'm like, "Okay, I can't do that. I'm a sprinter." And then I'm like, "I can't swim that far, so I ain't trying to swim a long distance." So I always had a passion for bikes. My dad formerly was a pro cyclist, competed as an amateur against other pro cyclists in Guyana, in South America, and he used to beat them on like really garbage bikes. But
Wow.
that kind of gave me inspiration. Like, bikes has always been in my life. So I'm like, I'm gonna bike across the country. And at the time, I only had a cycling coach who was my friend's dad, who cycled across Canada for Sears National Ride for Kids Cancer. But the difference with my ride, riding across Canada to raise money for kids in low-income communities, kids in poverty, kids in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, that's not sexy at all. Or even talking about systemic racism and how it operates and what we actually need to do. So it made it very difficult to raise money. If I had it for a lot of my friends who do stuff for like things that are more universal, like cancer or writing for paralysis, like different things, it's easier for them to raise fundings because it doesn't span a socio-political realm. Me advocating for the stuff I'm advocating for makes it hard for corporations to jump on right away, especially at that time. So I ended up just training with my coach for about 9 months, had no traction. I reached out to 800 people over the span of 9 months, and only 16 people said yes 1 month before the ride started. Those 16 people were Walmart, Canadian Tire, Enterprise, Dixie Ford, Muskoka Woods, MacDev Financial. This whole group of people ended up getting us a SUV, 7-seater SUV with a trailer on the back. We had food covered for every location. And then we had people in every city, 30 city stops, that opened up their house for us. So we only had to stay in the van one night, and we had to stay in a hotel one night. So all that came together 1 month prior. So it was literally me head down for like almost a year, just training, emailing, outreach, sales. I ended up going from a team of 1 person to 2, then 2 to like 200. So the 200 were like people in every city stop that also had a speaking venue. I had my marketing team here, my logistics team here. I had my videographer on the road, my driver, my support cyclist. So it all came together in the end. But I think I used the inspiration as Terry Fox, who ran across Canada for cancer research, and then also for Rick Hansen, who wheelchaired over 40,000 kilometers around the world to make the world more accessible for people with disabilities, and also to find a cure for paralysis. So those kinds of stories wanted me to become that figure for people who are in disenfranchised communities. Because to a point, Rick Hansen and Terry Fox motivate me, but there's one point where I'm just like, but I'm also from a neighborhood they're not from. And it's not to downgrade what they did. It's just that they're inspiring for us. They motivate us. But then we realize we don't really have someone who did an adventurous feat for our communities. So that's when I was like, maybe that will provide some motivation for young people, which it has, which has been one of the highlights of the trip.
Well, I was going to say, because when the thing was all said and done, and you got to see some of the impact, where you had kids coming up to you going, like, you're the guy that rode across Canada. Like it was like a Terry Fox moment for your neighborhood, right?
Yeah, it was. It definitely wasn't on the stature of like what Terry and Rick Hansen are, but for a neighborhood like
Same
mine,
principle though.
it's the same principle. They're just like, yo, this guy's crazy enough to quit football and ride across the country. I didn't get paid. I did raise 100K in 60 days, but I didn't get paid. That was all volunteer.
Well, but I think from that ride, I mean, one of the biggest sort of what's the word, like, impacts I think that has is that all across Canada, when you met with people, because you got to do speaking engagements, just conversations with community groups, like there was an educational component to this to get people to understand the circumstance and the situation that your neighborhood was faced with and what they were growing up with, and the challenges that they're faced with, that a lot of people in Canada that don't live in those neighborhoods have no idea, and they don't understand why it's so hard for people to get out of those circumstances. So you've sort of continued that journey. Butterflies in the Trenches is sort of the tipping point to your next set of projects, because everything you're doing now is built around making that community better, giving kids skill sets to develop. As a guy that's an educator now at UOIT and a background in education, you're using those skill sets now to help educate kids in a different way. STEM education is part of it, obviously, because you've got you've put some good tentacles together for that to help teach kids from a STEM education, which science, technology, engineering, and math for people that aren't familiar with it. But skill sets that they're going to need moving forward to get out of that circumstance. And what does that look like in real time with kids face to face?
Yeah. So in regards to the book or source code, was it source code you want me to reference?
Well, I just think of the way you're sort of looking, because you talked earlier about the education system that you guys grew up in, and how the education system doesn't recognize or understand the challenges that your community faced. And you've been able to provide, you're creating partnerships and augmented learning opportunities for kids to develop themselves in a way that wasn't available to you when you were younger. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I'll explain that. So basically, just so they understand structurally, like across all major institutions in Canada, so from housing, healthcare, employment, education, any system that we think of, the poorest outcomes across the system are either people who are in poor communities, poverty, people who are in Black and Indigenous communities. These are some of the most impoverished based on how the systems are set up. And when you look at that, it's not based on because of who these people are. It's based on how our system is designed to create these outcomes for these communities. So the example of education is that they've been streamlining kids into courses below their ability from K to 12. So basically, they're denying kids opportunities straight out of school. So kids are being funneled into courses below their ability, which limits their future prospects for university and college based on the courses you have. And kids tend to be 1 to 3 grade levels behind in reading and math by grade 3. This is not because of the abilities of kids. It's because of the way the system is designed and who they support and who they don't support in school. And me being an elementary teacher, I started to understand this reality that I talk about of what systemic racism looks like is the same reality in America. The only difference here is Canada's really just better at branding. We're better at branding our country as glorious and free, safe haven for all. And when you're in those communities, we're the only ones to understand. So because of that reality, I don't talk down on schools. I just know school has limited opportunities to help kids prepare for the future of work because of resources, professional development opportunities. So what I decided to do was to build a nonprofit. We actually just registered. So it's called Source Code Academy Canada. So basically what it is, it's an academy that prepares Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities for the future of work. So our goal is to work with kids K to 12 We want to bridge the gap, the educational divide and the digital gap between what I call the streets and Silicon Valley, because we want to be able to expose kids to things like STEM education, financial literacy, and entrepreneurship. But our lens is a bit different. Our lens is to use a holistic focus of the arts, mental health, social justice, in order to teach those kids those three things. Because if you don't focus on holistic development, then you're doing what our school system does. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a culture-focused academy that prepares kids for the future of work. And we're going to partner with schools. We're going to partner with community agencies. And we'll start in Scarborough, and then we'll branch out from there. And I already have conversations started with Northumberland Makers and Venture 13 in Coburg. I'd love to also have a program that focuses on the kids who live in poverty in Coburg as well. So there's different things where it can expand as like an online and an in-person program. So that's kind of what my solution is. And I think it'll be very revolutionary only because we're partnering educators with industry professionals and teaching our young people so they all can lead as a unit. So it's kind of like this idea of what I call tri-mentoring. It's idea of like industry professionals mentor post-secondary, high school, middle school, and middle school, grade school. So when you run all your different cohorts of programs and events and workshops, you're exposing kids to kids who are just at their peer level, but above their peer level, so they're able to learn. Because the interesting part with school is we're grades. A lot of schools around the world don't do grades anymore. Some schools actually do groupings. So they'll have like a classroom with like grade 1 to 3. They'll have a classroom with a range of kids from grade 4 to 6. And what they started to realize is the actual development and the educational achievement is a lot higher when you're mixed in groups that aren't just your peers. And I understand that because there's kind of like an internal mentorship model that's happening, and you learn actually better from your peers than from an educator. So the educator is actually no longer a knowledge keeper. You're a facilitator of knowledge sharing and tinkering and exploration. So that's kind of my mindset with Source Code Academy.
It's funny, you brought up a really interesting difference there. You're not a knowledge keeper, you're a facilitator. A facilitator is another version of a leader. And to make that shift from someone that is, because the thing is now, knowledge is not proprietary anymore with the internet. You can find out anything you want to find out pretty much. That model, that educational model of moving teachers into a position of facilitation and helping kids sort of step into whatever their strengths are, I think makes complete sense on so many different levels. Is it happening on any type of scale yet?
Yeah, there's some organizations doing it, but I think the way we're hitting it is going to be a bit different. So because of the way the structured realities exist, there's something called a school to prison pipeline. They're basically setting up our kids for jail based on how they're limiting these opportunities, how they fund the communities. So knowing that reality, a lot of programs start like 13 plus, 18 plus. Some programs just start at 6 to 13. We're strategically designing a program that will start K to 6 and grow to K to 12, because we understand the only solution to a pipeline that sets us up from school to prison is to create your own pipeline from kindergarten to industry. So I think that's the very interesting difference maker for Source Code Academy. And the cool part about it is we're hitting it with a culture focused approach. So when I mean culture focused, when you see me, people don't see me as like, oh, this kid used to be a childhood drug dealer, and now he's a self-taught app developer. He's an award-winning author. I used to run a coding and robotics school as the director of operations. I'm a keynote speaker, and I'm a consultant for post-secondary and also K-12 principals and educators. They don't see that when they look at me. That's the issue. When I see someone, I never assume. Like sometimes I show up to these gigs, at corporate gigs, in a hoodie, and they assume I'm there like I'm the janitor or I'm the cleaner. And I'm like, nah, I'm your keynote speaker.
Don't judge a book, right?
Yeah. So I'm trying to explain that obviously there's certain events you want to dress up, like a wedding and, different things like that. But for young people, if kids want to wear a hat in Source Code Academy, that's not an issue. I'm not going to send a kid to the office, which happens in high school and middle school. Go to the office. You're not taking off your hat. No hoods in the school. Like all these different rules. In my head, I'm like, you have no clue what that kid has gone through to come to school today. I'm happy they're here, even if they're late. You know what I mean? We'll have a conversation after about, is there anything I can do to support? Like, you've been coming late. Like, you need to talk to kids with a sense of love, right? And people learn from people they like. They don't learn from people who they don't like. You know what I mean?
Right. That's so true.
It's so simple, but that's kind of like my mindset as a difference maker. But I think there's a power in partnership. So I don't see us as something separate. I'm actively looking at partnerships with other models. 'Cause I feel like we can complement each other on a lot of different avenues. Mine will be different because I'm the only one run in Canada by someone who's street involved. All the other people got successful in academia or business, left, and then came back to do something. I'm still in the hood. I'm still out here. I'm still from that neighborhood. So my approach to running it is more inclusive for people who get kicked out of school, kids who are incarcerated, because those are my friends and my family, right? So I think ours will be a lot more inclusive for all parties.
I think, well, first of all, I want people to find out a little bit more about you because anybody that's watched this chat right now, I'm pretty sure is feeling pretty motivated, pretty inspired to have some impact elsewhere. The book is called Butterflies in the Trenches, Curtis Carmichael. Curtis, where can people get more information, or if they want to get involved or help out with donations, or like you said, like they want to start their, they want to have some creative impact in the community. What's the best way to get a hold of you or find out more about your story?
Yeah, so you can find out more about my story at curtiscarmichael.ca. It's just CURTISCARMICHAEL.ca, or you can follow me on any social platform at Curtis Carmichael with an extra C on the end. So CURTISCARMICC. And that's the best way to stay in touch right now. We're actually finalizing our Source Code Academy website in the next couple of weeks. So that'll be live and I'll connect it to my personal website. But the only place you can get that book, and the book's the world's first augmented reality memoir. So it comes with a free app. You only can get the app and the book on my website. And you can also share it on, I think, iOS as well. So that's the only place they can get it. It won't be available anywhere else strategically.
curtiscarmichael.ca is a good place to start, man. Thank you for sharing your story with this. This is the second time we've had this kind of discussion because your book launch, after we had the book launch, I'm like, okay, I got to chat with this guy on a different level. And it's just, I find it just really interesting how you've just sort of kept moving forward, and every step you take, you make a different impact on the people around you. And I know we've only sort of scratched the surface about what you got going on in the background. Maybe down the road, we'll have a chat when things start to come forward for you. So to you and your team and everybody, congratulations on everything so far. And I can't wait to see what the future holds for you.
Man, thanks for the opportunity. We'll be back again, round 2, round 3.
I'm in.
Yeah, I'm in.